Welcome to What Matters Now, the Times of Israel's weekly podcast that explores one key issue currently shaping Israel and the Jewish world. I'm your host, Amanda Borschel-Dan, and this week I'm speaking with law professor Dr. Cochav Elkayam-Levy. October 7th was not the first time that rape was weaponized in warfare, and if history teaches anything, it also won't be the last. Almost immediately following Hamas's murderous onslaught on southern Israel, humanitarian law expert Dr. Cochav Elkayam-Levy established and now heads the Civil Commission on October 7th Crimes by Hamas against women and children. She also lectures at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem and Reichman University, but since October 7th, Cochav and her staff have poured over thousands of pieces of documentation, videos, testimony that chronicle Hamas's systemic and systematic use of rape and sexual violence against women. Now, amid the deafening silence and lack of condemnation of this violence from international bodies, including the 30-year-old United Nations Office of the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, Cochav was awarded recently with the Israel Prize, the highest honor the state of Israel bestows. This week, I visited the headquarters of the Civil Commission on October 7th Crimes by Hamas against women and children for a wide-ranging conversation, but listener discretion is advised. So this week, we ask Dr. Cochav Elkayam-Levy, what matters now? Cochav, thank you so much for letting me join you today in your offices.
Thank you so much for coming here.
It's going to be a hard conversation, and so anyone who's listening with children, I firmly recommend that they don't listen to this conversation. We are going to talk about Cochav's work for which she received the Israel Prize, the premier prize from the State of Israel, and it's graphic. What can you do? Parts of it are. So Cochav, tell us very briefly what you've been doing since October 7th, and then we'll back up and talk about everything else.
Wow. It seems like every day is like 2 weeks. And so I'll try to share most of the things that have happened. So since the 7th of October, we actually went to a global campaign for recognition of the horrific crimes that were committed against women, children, and now we're also documenting the crimes against families as well. And it started from silence of the most important organizations in the world, international UN organizations that were supposed to protect us and were supposed to stand by our side from the very beginning. And their silence motivated us to take action. And perhaps most importantly, it was seeing the hostages taken into Gaza, women, children, barefoot, entire families dragged so violently, and women dragged Shani Luke's body. We all have her image in mind. And we wanted those UN organizations that were so silent to act swiftly, to act quickly, to help us get them back.
You put a lot of faith in the UN, of course, because as a law professor, you've always taught about these different bodies and their importance in the world. And then all of a sudden, hey, this is happening in Israel to mostly Jews, and there's silence, as you said. I'm sure that was a huge betrayal. And I know very early on you were in New York and you addressed the UN. And in fact, outside of the UN, there's a huge protest. And that was the first time that I personally saw women protesting smeared with fake blood, but to show how graphic this abuse and this violence was and unfortunately is against women since October 7th.
Wow, it was one of the hardest days in my life. I was delivering a speech during that rally outside of the UN. It was early December. It was already a month of us fighting for the UN and the international community to recognize what happened to women, for UN women to simply announce, condemn the crimes, express solidarity with the victims, offer help, offer help with the return of the hostages, with the treatment of victims, with the human suffering that we saw here. And I was actually shaking. It was the first time that, you know how when you deliver a speech, you're always nervous. But my entire body, I was shaking. It was a moment when all of us gathered and I, usually we work behind the scenes or in offices, and we were outside, and the screams of Israeli women, Jewish women, non-Jewish women who came to express solidarity, me too, unless I'm a Jew, me too, unless I'm a Jew, was just heartbreaking. I couldn't breathe. I was thinking about all the devastating sense of isolation, of neglect, of anti-Semitism, really, of marking us as Jews as different, and the sense that it's such a dangerous development, but because you can expect that from the popular audience, like you can expect that from protest groups, but not from institutions, not from international human rights institutions. And I can say that as an international law professor and an expert in human rights and teaching about feminist theories and our fight as a global movement, I had a lot of belief in this system. I'm rebuilding this belief because we can't give up the belief in an functioning international legal system that stands for human rights.
So I think your first reaction of betrayal and disbelief that this international body and also many, many other international women's organizations, the silence, the resounding, the deafening silence that you heard from these organizations, that was perhaps the first step, but perhaps that also brought you to even more action, and action that made you perhaps even more independent from these bodies. So since then, you created a commission. Tell us about that.
I want to say that international law is generally weak. International human rights organizations are weak. The power of international law is declarative in many ways. It's a soft field of law. And they took the most basic power that victims have of recognition by those bodies, just recognizing what happened. And I think what we saw and what was so difficult is to see the failure of the softest mechanisms that are protecting human rights. And so this is what we're trying now with meetings with people who care about international legal systems to think through, to think how we can change it, to think how we can reform and really try to promise something else for future generations. And we were forced to establish a commission. It was from the understanding that we are alone, that if we won't do it, we are going to lose the most important historical record of what happened to women. Much of the information was circulating and coming to us, and I felt personal responsibility to document everything. We gathered as experts, understanding that we are facing a historical mission to preserve the historical record, preserve the truth, preserve the fractions of stories that we got, the informations, the videos that we got, the images. I actually feel a bit angry today, I must admit, Amanda. Angry because we were experiencing one of the hardest times in the history of the Jewish people here in Israel. And a week afterwards, we were exposing ourselves to the most traumatic materials. And it's scarring. And it's really, we now know the effect of these materials. And already in the second week, I was working on Telegram groups, trying to collect as much information as possible. And for what? To convince them that it happened? Of course, I realized that very quickly that outside of Israel, they knew much more than us. Because here in Israel, because of the families of the victims, we weren't receiving all the information, all the images. And outside of Israel, there was more information circulating. And I was shocked. Oh my God, did that happen? Everything that was reported in international media was very difficult to bear witness to. And as I said, we were forced to do this. We took upon ourselves a role that is still very difficult. Every day is difficult. The very simple task of hiring people to work on these very difficult materials, I feel a huge responsibility on each person joining us to make sure they have the resilience and they have the all the support system to handle this, because these are the most difficult testimonies and videos and images that one can see. So,
what is really dismaying, for lack of a better term, is, of course, the denialism. And does it really matter if there's one more piece of evidence or one more witness to a horrific rape, beheading, sodomy, all of the actions that did occur on October 7th and potentially are still occurring to those who are still hostage? Does it really matter? Do you feel like you need to, are you compelled to archive, to chronicle every single possible piece of evidence?
Exactly, definitely. I think what's amazing is that once we understood that we have to document everything, I was saying to my colleagues, we have to establish an international archive under the most compelling international norms. And I knew this is our mission. I didn't know how to do it yet. I didn't know what it entails. I'm laughing because perhaps if I knew what it entails, I wouldn't have done it. But it's really complex. Our goal now is to create an archive that will last for generations to come. We have Yad Vashem people supporting us. Actually, the head of the archive, of the Commission's archive, is the former deputy head of Yad Vashem archive. Her name is Leonard. She's amazing. We have a Yad Vashem documenters helping us, and we know that we are creating a database that will serve researchers, investigators, prosecutors, perhaps international tribunals in the future, and academic research that will help to fight this denial. So
it's not the first time that rape is being weaponized. It won't be the last, obviously, because in the history of warfare, this has definitely occurred. And in fact, you mentioned the Holocaust. There's the famous Ravensbrück archive that was sealed for 50 years after getting hundreds of testimonials from women who were sexually abused, raped, etc. And it was put to the side for 50 years and then opened. And I wonder, is it too soon to have this archive that you're compiling to be open, to be fresh? Because there is also, of course, the idea of consent, right? These women who, especially those who are killed, cannot give their consent to the rape that they endured and now must be documented. So it's so difficult here in Israel. Of course, we are all connected. I just got a phone call from my son, of course, that 2 of his friends fell in the war. We all know people who are affected by this war. So how do you deal with these issues of privacy and the directive, the real mission to document?
Thank you so much for that question. This is an excellent question. The archive is, first of all, it's now concealed, and it's going to have strict release policy. It's not going to be open for the public. Some of the testimonies, I can give you an example. Someone from Be'eri reached out to me to tell me that she wants to give a testimony and she wants it concealed for the next 50 years. So that's what we'll do. And with regard to the privacy of the materials, we are thankful for the experts in privacy and privacy laws and for Microsoft that have given us a secured system to store all the information, storage space. Tech companies in Israel have been amazing in supporting this work, and especially Microsoft, and standing by our side in doing that in the most respectful way to the victims and to their families, and perhaps with a little hope of bringing justice to what was done here.
We've heard that, of course, Sinwar, the most evil mastermind perhaps since Hitler, used rape and prepared his soldiers, his terrorists, to use rape as a means of warfare. How widespread do you think it was?
That's also an excellent question. It's too early to determine. It's too early to determine. And I remember telling, I was asked this so many times in the beginning, and we were debating among ourselves how to answer this question. And we had a 2-hour conversation just about that. How do we provide estimations and the estimation of what we know? And we decided that, first of all, the most important thing to understand is that we will never know. We will never know how many were sexually abused. Some of the bodies were burned to ashes. Some of the bodies, for instance, and thank you for providing a trigger alert. I'm doing it again now. As I was saying, some of them were burned to ashes. And there are cases in which we see burned bodies in ways that you can see that they were sexually abused, naked bodies that were found in several areas, and special patterns that repeated in different places. So, and I used to say that whoever is going to give any estimation would be doing injustice with the victim, would be providing information that we still don't know.
The idea of humanitarian law is new in the history of legal academia, shall we say. Legal academia is perhaps also new, but especially, of course, this idea of sexual abuse, sexual warfare, and against women specifically, but also against families. So let's talk about a new term, shall we say, that you and Professor Erwin Kotler have coined, dealing with the genocide of families, the targeting of families specifically, and that is a genocide. So talk to us about this idea as well.
So I've had the privilege since the 7th of October to meet prominent academic scholars, experts, human rights experts around the world. One of them is Professor Erwin Kotler, and the meetings with him have been extremely meaningful for me.
He's such a mensch, but also the former Justice Minister of Canada, a world internationally recognized expert in humanitarian law and so many other things. We cannot give enough praise to Professor Erwin Kotler.
Exactly. Thank you so much for saying that. I can't thank him enough. And in one of our conversations, I told him, Professor Kotler, you know, the hardest videos that we have in our archive are actually those of families. Those of families in their last moments when the terrorists entered their houses, destroyed everything. The children are screaming, little children. The parents' eyes are terrified. It's something that you can't bear. I told him that I can't even, we only see fractions of what they experienced for hours and are still experiencing. Those who have still family members in Gaza Strip taken hostage. Families were separated, brutally abused. It's nothing that really, I saw so many horrible materials, but these materials I can't even breathe speaking of them. And I had my the CEO of the commission, Merav, I told her perhaps you would be able to just, I don't want to watch this, but just if you can describe what we're seeing, and just hearing her describing what's in the videos, I couldn't. And I told Professor Kotler, I think we're seeing the kind of abuse that is not yet defined in international law. Family abuse that is so devastating, so cruel, that I think we're seeing a new crime against humanity. And I didn't know, as a woman, I didn't know I had this internal, I was questioning myself. Am I saying something really, I don't know, that is
out of step, out of place? Am I?
Exactly.
I know what you feel. And Cochav, if there's anyone who needs to speak up, it's you. So please.
So, yes. And he looked at me and he said, wow, Cochav, this is brilliant. We have to write about it. You have to do something about it. Please put this in words. Try to describe the kind of familial abuse that you're seeing. He was mind blown. And seeing his reaction, understanding the importance of this. Of course, both of us have shared this with international scholars around the world to get their opinion of whether this is something that is contributing to the legal discourse, to humanity, really. And we wrote about it recently in this op-ed at the Times of Israel. And with your help of thinking of these issues, we were able to coin a term, the term kinocide. And the word kin in Latin means family and has a lot of other references to family relationships. So thank you so much also for the platform to bring this to light and to call upon states now and to call upon the international legal system to raise to the challenge of fighting this, of preventing this, of understanding this dynamics of war, of warfare, that the weaponization of families, I'm just saying that gives me the shivers. The fact that this happened so cruelly, and we are now learning from other atrocities in the world and the kind of abuse that was in specific cases. We have researchers working on that. We are documenting familial abuse that happened during the 7th of October. And if I thought, as I told you from the beginning, this just becomes harder. It's the most complex mission that I ever led in my life.
If your terrible nightmare is the kinocide documentation, for me, seeing the recent footage of the 5 female soldiers, especially since I have a female fighting soldier right now, that is a whole other world of terribleness that I couldn't face. I couldn't watch the 3 minutes. I just, even from the pictures and seeing their pretty pajamas and their bloody faces, it's just horrifying. And I wonder if in your documentation, you've been able to delve into what happened to the soldiers specifically and what potentially is still happening to them today if they are alive. I don't think we know for certain either way, especially after a spate of 7 bodies just came back and we had thought that so many of them were still alive. Do you have any thoughts about the soldiers in particular?
Yes. Again, thank you for this question. We've been documenting crimes against women from the very beginning, and especially the crimes against young women. And in every meeting that we conduct since the 7th of October, we are sharing our grave concern to those women. And we decided very early on that we are not differentiating between soldiers and civilians in this specific case, and we're documenting everything. And one of the things that I'm repeating again and again to leaders, world leaders, that they are just high school graduates, that people think of them as soldiers, but they are just 18, 19 years old who are serving in a mandatory service, and to shed light on their humanity, to be able to empathize with the suffering that we sometimes feel like we need to convince people of the horrible things that they have suffered and the urgency of getting them back. So their situation has been concerning from the very beginning. We have been fighting for them. We have been fighting for them to return and for the international community to do everything in its power to bring them back.
We began our conversation talking about how betrayed you felt by the disbelief, the denialism of this weaponization of sexual abuse. And at the same time, we hear voices out of Gaza through the Hamas propaganda machine that Israeli soldiers are doing the same thing. And it's very difficult, of course, as a mother of 3 soldiers, to give any kind of credence to this. And I don't think it's true. But I wonder if in the international institutions, they're equating these claims. Are they saying, oh, you're claiming this, but the Palestinians, meaning Hamas, is claiming this is happening as well. Are you hearing this in your discussions?
Definitely. This is one of the issues that is most troubling. The moral equivalence is that it's being done, equating the suffering and the use of sexual abuse as a weapon of war by Hamas to what incidents of sexual abuse that perhaps happened by the IDF and the allegations that have been heard. It's something that is deeply troubling and for many months now. And I want to share that before the UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women came to Israel, I expressed hesitation in her visit specifically because of this. Because in her announcement, she put in the same paragraph of announcing that she wants to come and investigate the sexual abuse of the 7th of October. In the same paragraph, it was only weeks after the 7th of October. We are now talking months afterwards. But this, I think it was late November, that she released that announcement. That was one of the first announcements that she made. And I was shocked to see the moral equivalence she's making between coming to investigate the 7th of October, the abuse of Hamas in the 7th of October, the sexual abuse, and IDF, allegations against IDF on sexual abuse in the West Bank. And I immediately was alerted and warned against this moral equivalence, that we should be very careful of what can come out from this kind of investigation, not because I was worried about what would come up in the IDF. I'm not representing the state of Israel. I couldn't be more, I've been very critical of the government throughout my career. I'm a human rights lawyer, but just because it's misleading to say that the IDF is weaponizing sexual abuse or implying that, it's misleading. So after Pramila Patton came here, we found her staff very professional. We've met with them for hours, discussing the sexual abuse committed on the 7th of October and expressing our concerns of what we've seen here. And the report really, for around 20 pages, outlined the brutality, the systematicity in Hamas's attack, and just a few paragraphs were dedicated to what was found in the IDF. That, of course, was a very minimal reference. But then, of course, this minimal reference became the moral equivalence that we were so afraid of. So we were participating in the UN Security Council meeting, the one meeting that was dedicated for the victims of the 7th of October, of the sexual abuse committed on the 7th of October. I came to New York. We sat there for hours listening to state after state declaring their condemnation of the IDF, of Israel, of the use of sexual abuse. They really manipulated what the special rapporteurs reported to create this equivalence. Unfortunately, the General Secretary itself released a report that dedicated a section to Israel and Hamas together, again implying this moral equivalence, inserting recommendations to both organizations as if, so unlike any other instance, this is really manipulative use of what happened. And I think the greatest failure is that Israel is now mentioned in this report. This report is dedicated to the worst instances of weaponization of sexual abuse. It's a yearly report of the General Secretary. And of course, now Israel has become part of it. As part of this trend of moral equivalence, of blaming Israel for suffering that in this case is simply wrong.
There is a real lack of moral clarity, it appears to me, when it comes to what happened on October 7th itself. One can, of course, see the devastation of Gaza. There is suffering in Gaza. There's no doubt, right? But the equivalency and mashing it all together, when we see October 7th Israel was attacked. It was an onslaught. Atrocities were committed. Israel did not commit them. And so why do you think, Cochav, that despite all the evidence, they had to add this little paragraph that, of course, became a platform, a springboard for what you saw at the UN?
They failed. They shouldn't have done it. They simply failed. Why they did that? This is something that needs to be investigated. I don't want to even answer for political reasons, because political reasons are not enough reasons to manipulate the facts, to manipulate such and make such grave accusations against the country. We are at a sad moment in history, really. They are, as an expert, I'm talking as a feminist expert, as an expert in women's rights, and the fact that they included Israel in this report is a huge professional failure. Above all, you know, I've had an interesting meeting with Deborah Lipstadt, Ambassador Lipstadt, and her staff, and I told them that what we're seeing are really two processes of first dehumanization. From the very beginning, their silence has been dehumanizing us. I remember when I delivered the speech at the UN CEDAW committee, before the UN CEDAW committee, it's the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, one of the most important committees in the world. I was delivering a speech and saying, is there international law for Israeli women? Is it going to protect us? You are really inflicting on us the same denial mechanism that are being inflicted on sexual abuse victims, but now collectively. And the haunting question that kept coming in my mind, are we even human? Can't they express simple solidarity with us? Empathy with the suffering that we're seeing all around us? So one of the most worrying processes that we're seeing in the UN is dehumanizations of us as Israelis and as Israeli women. They perfectly know all the difficult dynamics, patriarchal dynamics that we need to navigate here in Israel. And there's no excuse and no justification. And the second process that we're seeing since the 7th of October is demonization, the abuse of the UN system to demonize us. And I'm not talking again months now that we can't overlook the suffering that is happening in Gaza. I'm talking about the very first weeks and days after the attack that the UN system was already used to demonize us, to not mention the 7th of October, not, for instance, the CEDAW committee, this committee on the elimination of discrimination against women, releases a statement. It was the 29th of October, not mentioning the 7th of October, not mentioning our hostages. So I can give many examples of this manipulation of what happened.
We've been talking a lot about international institutions, and every time there's a picture released from the war cabinet or even the broader cabinet, I try and count the women, and usually the women in there are serving coffee. And I wonder if this too is a bit of a betrayal. I mean, we are more than 50% of the population, and yet we're not represented here in Israel. And do you feel some kind of betrayal about that as well? Meaning the women's voices were so silenced internationally in light of all of the atrocities committed. But here in Israel, we recognize the atrocities, and yet women's voices are so silenced when it comes to how this war is playing out and how the hostages are meant to return.
So definitely, I spoke at the UN as a representative of the women's movement, women's protest movement here in Israel. We were fighting for gender equality here in Israel, against the low representation of women, against the silencing of our voices nationally. I felt so exhausted during those months before the 7th of October in the protests. We were fighting for many years. I didn't start, it's just for many years. We were fighting for our rights, our really most basic rights of having a voice in the most important decision-making positions. And of course, the year before, we saw the lowest representation of women and deliberate policies against us. And I think, as you said, this is the hardest realization, that we are isolated internationally and in many ways silenced nationally. And I remember saying a few weeks after the 7th of October, I felt like we failed. We failed here in Israel, and we've been in many ways left alone in this battle.
Cochav, I don't want to end the conversation here because that's so deeply depressing. We are definitely speaking of serious things, but I would like to say for me personally, and for my daughters, I have 3 daughters, 4 sons. For my daughters, as we watched you receive the Israel Prize, we were all crying, and we were so inspired by your work. Thank you for giving me your time.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to the Times of Israel's weekly podcast, What Matters Now. I'm your host, Amanda Borschel-Dan. What Matters Now is produced by the Podwaves. If you have any questions or comments about this or any other episode, please drop us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. Until next week, shalom.